Donald Trump is a convicted felon.
We are delving into what could be one of the worst decisions for our democracy. No one else in the history of New York has ever been pursued except for Donald Trump.
That's correct.
Let's talk about the hush money.
There was absolutely no crime involved in paying her to keep that story quiet.
Do you agree with that?
No. Payment was made 2 weeks before the election. It was done with the intent to make sure it did not come out before.
Do you believe this case will be reversed? Well, tonight we are delving into what could be one of the worst decisions for our democracy. This is the first time in the history of the country the Justice Department has weaponized to such a serious degree a sitting president has allowed former President Donald Trump to face federal charges in a state court. Now, after a 5-week trial in Manhattan, Donald Trump was found guilty on 34 counts of falsifying business records. Take a look.
Former President Donald Trump is a convicted felon. Let that sink in.
This was a rigged trial by a convicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace.
Silence in the courtroom from former President Donald Trump and his team as each of those 34 counts of guilty were read aloud. Reporters inside the courtroom noting his face was red as he turned to leave. On Friday, Trump addressed the media, building on his claims that the trial was rigged, describing Judge Juan Merchan as conflicted and corrupt, while providing no evidence for his claims.
If they can do this to me, they can do this to anyone. These are bad people. These are, in many cases, I believe, sick people. So we have a judge who's highly conflicted. You know what the confliction is. Nobody wants to write about it, and I'm not allowed to talk about it. If I do, he said, I get put in jail.
Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg praised the jury for their work on this case.
We have the most important voice of all, and that's the voice of the jurors. They have spoken. Donald J. Trump has been convicted of 34 counts of falsifying business records.
All of this stemming from Trump's efforts to cover up a hush money payment to adult film star Stormy Daniels ahead of the 2016 presidential election. Trump has continually denied the payment and any affair with Daniels.
Well, if this could happen to ex-President Donald Trump, it could happen to any one of us. I believe that this is a travesty of justice. I believe it was unfair to Donald Trump and an abuse of our legal system with damaging consequences. And this is not about Donald Trump. This is about abuse of process. This is about due process. And this opens a Pandora's box of extreme proportion. And joining me tonight to discuss this historic case are former prosecutor and News on Merritt Street anchor Loni Coombs, and my good friend who has left an indelible mark on the courtroom, a Dallas trial lawyer for 50 years, recognized as one of the best lawyers in this city 11 times, just an absolute brilliant legal mind with a commitment to justice, Mr. Rod Phelan. Welcome these experts, please. Now, Rod, I have said that I thought this was a travesty of justice, and I guess what I'm talking about is the fact that this was a case supposedly about hush money. This was a case about business records that were supposedly illegal. And first off, let's talk about the hush money that this whole thing was predicated on. There's a problem with that, and the problem is that there's nothing wrong. This is a made-up term to sound scandalous, but that's just another term for a non-disclosure agreement, is it not?
There are thousands, millions of non-disclosure agreements. Their very purpose is to hush up the person who is receiving the payment to be quiet. That's what a non-disclosure agreement is. And this prosecution in this case was allowed to say that paying her for silence was illegal. But she had no duty to tell that story. She had every right to keep it quiet or sell it. And paying her to keep that story quiet was You can be critical of it. You can think that wasn't a nice thing to do, nor was her story a nice one to hear. But there was absolutely no crime involved in paying her to keep that story quiet. And that's the heart of the case, that this was an illegal payment.
But if there's no crime in paying someone to not tell a story that is not flattering, if there's no crime in that, Loni, then how is there a case to be brought against a defendant based on how you keep those records?
Right. So the prosecution theory in this case was that there were falsified documents, right? So we all know having an affair is not a crime. Paying hush money is not a crime. Having an NDA is not a crime. But when it is done by someone who is running for political office, that person is now subject to laws and rules under campaign finance rules, election laws, that the normal person isn't. So if we did an NDA, we wouldn't have anybody looking at us so closely. But if we are running for office, then all of a sudden we have these other rules applying to us.
Okay, but keeping the records, this was not a campaign expense. This was a personal expense, was it not?
So that is what the prosecution said. No, it was a campaign expense. And they talked about it being, if it was not done within the time that it was done, right before the election, that is what the prosecution believes showed was the intent to interfere with the election. So Stormy Daniels came forward in 2016 and tried to sell her story at the beginning of the year. Nobody wanted it. Nobody cared about it. When the Access Hollywood tape came out in October 7th, just before the election, then all of a sudden the negotiations started to try and work out this deal with Stormy Daniels. It was actually done. The money was wired on the 27th. So the prosecution said, this is evidence of intent to try and interfere with the election. It's not just a typical payment, hush money, NDA. It is because of the timing of the deal, because of everything else that was going on in the campaign. That's what they said showed that this was an attempt, an intent to interfere with the election.
What do you say to that, Rod?
Well, the prosecution did pitch the case as a, quote, election fraud case, pure and simple. But election fraud has to be something that was illegal that happened before the election. But Trump was only indicted for creating records about paying Cohen back after the election. Trump was not charged with doing anything before the election. So if what you're charged with doing happened after the election, it can't be an election fraud case.
No, but your point is this happened in 2017 is when they made these entries, these bookkeeping entries, was after the election.
That's right, that's right. And that's the interesting thing. So the way the prosecutor had to file this was the initial argument, the initial charge is falsifying the documents, right? So all of the payments were falsified because they said they were legal expenses. It wasn't this reimbursement.
After the election.
And they were all paid after the election. However, the prosecution put on a case that said the agreement that was made between Trump and David Pecker, and David Pecker testified to this, and Michael Cohen, this arrangement to try and keep these bad stories out of the press started way back in August of 2015.
And was not illegal.
No, that arrangement's not illegal. However, that's part of it. And then when the payment was made to Stormy Daniels at the time just before the election, that part goes into the financial documents. So the financial documents were actually not falsified until after the election. You're absolutely correct.
But the payment was not illegal.
No, well, that's what the prosecution is saying. It's not the hush money payment that's illegal. It's the intent to interfere with the election by making that to suppress the story.
Right. All right. Well, we've got to take a break. We're going to talk more about this. Coming up, why Rod says there were skunks in the jury box. He'll explain what he means by that right after the break.
Here in Manhattan, the scales of justice are weighed down by politics. For the district attorney, justice isn't blind. It's about looking for opportunities to advance a political agenda, a radical political agenda. Rather than enforcing the law, the DA is using his office to do the bidding of left-wing campaign funders.
If you're worried about IRS collection tactics, you don't have to face them alone. Tax Network USA is here to help. Tax Network USA is the nation's premier tax relief firm and has negotiated over $1 billion in tax relief for clients. Our services include penalty forgiveness, hardship programs where you might not have to repay anything until your tax debt expires, and offer in compromise solutions for lump sum settlements. Whether you owe $10,000 or $10 million, our experts are ready to assist you. Even if you're behind on taxes due to missing personal or business records, Tax Network USA can guide you through the process. Tax season is long over, and for the IRS, that means it's collection season. To schedule complimentary consultation, call 1-800-958-1000 or visit tnusa.com/Dr. Phil. Don't let the IRS's aggressive tactics control your life. Take charge of your financial future. Visit tnusa.com/Dr. Phil today.
It was a rigged trial. We wanted a venue change where we could have a fair trial. We didn't get it. We wanted a judge change. We wanted a judge that wasn't conflicted. The judge allowed them to go into everything that I was ever involved in, not this case, everything that I was ever involved in, which is a first. Was he a bad boy here? Was he a bad boy there? We weren't allowed to use our election expert under any circumstances. You saw what happened to some of the witnesses that were on our side. They were literally crucified by this man.
Well, I'm here tonight with former DA Loni Coombs and former Dallas trial lawyer Rod Phelan discussing Donald Trump's historic guilty verdict. Now, I want to look quickly at a timeline of what took place here, because in 2006, Daniels says she had sex with Trump. He says not so. Then 2015, Trump decides to run for president. And then in October of 16, this is a month before the election, Daniels' lawyer makes a $130,000 hush money demand, and Trump's lawyer Cohen pays it. November 2016, he wins the election. February 2017, he starts paying Cohen back plus taxes. Now, November 2020, Alvin Bragg makes a campaign promise that if he's elected DA, he will go after Trump. He wins. And then in April 2023, DA Bragg indicts Trump. And then in April 2024, he tells the jury in an opening statement that this is a case of election fraud, pure and simple. And then in May 2024, the jury convicts Trump. Now let's back up to the one right before being convicted. That's where he says that he tells the jury in opening statements, this is a case of election fraud, pure and simple. And he makes a campaign promise that he's going to get him. Now, here's the thing. He says he made illegal payments. Were those payments illegal?
They were not by any stretch. And the fact that a campaigning politician made them does not alter that conclusion. Anybody can pay for silence if the person he's paying has no duty to tell the story she wants to tell. If she's free to sit on that story or tell it or sell it, paying her does not become a crime, whether you're a politician or anyone else.
All right, do you agree with that?
No.
You don't agree with it because?
Because I think the law of what the prosecution's arguing here is that it's not just a hush money payment. That could have been made back in 2016 at any time, years before. It was made 2 weeks before the election. It was done, arguably, is what the prosecution is saying, it was done with the intent to make sure it did not come out before the election, and that is considered to be election interference. That's what they're arguing. If it's done by unlawful means, right? Unlawful means, and then we're getting into the jury instructions of—
Rod?
Election interference is not a crime. He was charged with falsifying business records to cover up a legal payment. So the charge was not you interfered with the election. That was the lawyer's argument, the prosecutor's argument. But that's not a crime. So they twisted the law, which makes it legal to pay someone to sit on a story she has no duty to tell, to make it a crime, election interference, which isn't a crime. And then they used something that happened after the election to shore that up.
Well, it's in the jury instructions given to the jury about the election crime. That
Was
was
it in the
predicate.
indictment?
So the indictment, no. And that believe me, there's issues with the legal case. I'm not denying that at all. I agree there are many issues with the legal case.
Well, that's
I'm
a
just
yes or
sticking
no
to-
question. Was it in the indictment?
No, it was not. It was not. And not only that, but there was a lot that wasn't in the indictment that the DA then put into a statement of facts later. But the issue and the problem with that is every defendant under the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution has the right to know the charges against them. In this case, the indictment didn't lay all of this out. In fact, no one found out about this until during the trial.
Isn't that a bit of a problem?
That is a problem.
A huge problem.
That's a very big question of whether due process was violated here.
Yeah, and that's what we're saying. If you get charged with something, you kind of ought to know what it is.
Right.
And if you go on trial for something, you ought to kind of know what you're being tried for.
That's right.
Because you kind of want to make your defense in response to what you're being tried for. And if you don't know that until during the trial,
Yes.
that's a problem.
Yeah.
There were two things going on here, in my view, with the way the prosecutor charged this case. He charged only falsifying business records, but he put out a separate document that he didn't want to charge Trump with doing, but it said he violated the federal campaign contribution laws, he violated the federal tax laws, and he committed election interference by conspiring to make this payment before the election. Well, a New York prosecutor's got no jurisdiction over federal campaign contribution law or federal tax law, and he knew better than to actually try to prove that this payment for silence was a crime. He argued it, but didn't ask the jury to find it and didn't charge for it.
He just prejudiced them with all of that information. And you agree he didn't have jurisdiction.
No, the way I see it is that he laid out, he charged falsifying of business documents, which he can do. But the problem with it is that was a misdemeanor. The statute of limitations had run, so he couldn't just stick there. So then he had to add a predicate crime to make it, in other words, a second crime to make it a felony.
And we're going to talk about what that was or wasn't when we come back. Why D.A. Bragg made good on his campaign promise, we're going to talk about that as well after the break.
Specific to Alvin Bragg, the issue here is that he ran on the entire position of getting Donald Trump. That was one of the core pillars of his campaign to become the district attorney in Manhattan.
We sued his administration more than 100 times since this DACA Muslim travel ban. I will hold him accountable by following the facts where they go.
And so now you have somebody who basically said, I'm gonna go get somebody, regardless of what the charges might be, regardless of what you might think a potential crime might be. His entire campaign was focused on getting Donald Trump. That's why he's coming under scrutiny, because this is political, not actually about following the law.
At the AG's office, I held Trump accountable for his misconduct with the Trump Foundation. We did the Trump University case. We sued his administration more than 100 times since this DACA Muslim travel ban. I will hold him accountable by following the facts where they go.
Well, Alvin Bragg was the DA in the Trump trial. We just heard him while campaigning saying he was out to get Trump. Now, according to the American Bar Association, the primary duty of the prosecutor is to seek justice within the bounds of the law, not merely to convict. So clearly, Loni, this was unethical.
That was a tainted position to take. He's biased, and that's not what prosecutors are supposed to be doing, right? You're not supposed to say, I'm going to go after somebody. You're supposed to say, what's the evidence? What are the facts? And then determine it from there. He didn't even look at the investigation before he did that. He was still running for DA. So once he then became DA, he should have not been involved in the prosecution if there was one at all.
Now, the lead prosecutor on this case came from where?
One of the lead prosecutors was a DOJ attorney, prosecutor. He had left the office and had joined the state prosecutor's office in December of 2022, and this indictment came in March of 2023.
So that's a step down.
I would say federal prosecutors would see it as a step down. Yeah, they see themselves as here versus state.
So they come from Biden's Department of Justice, steps down to a state position as a prosecutor, and then is in the case against Donald Trump.
Yes, he's one of the lead prosecutors.
Okay.
But for people who say that this was, a Biden investigation, we do have to point out that the Southern District of New York which is run by the U.S. Attorney General picked by Biden, right? That federal court chose not to prosecute this case. Those prosecutors looked at, and they are the most aggressive district in the country as far as prosecutors. They looked at this case, they investigated, and they chose not to file any charges.
Right. In fact, Bragg looked at this earlier and decided not to prosecute it.
Correct. And his predecessor looked at it and never filed any charges.
Yeah. And the statute of limitations had run on both ends of the charges in this case, but they put them together, linked them up, and figured a way to breathe life back into them to go after Trump.
They literally revived them. That's correct.
And has that ever been done against anyone else in the state of New York?
A state prosecutor in New York has never done that using a predicate crime of a federal election charge like they did in this case.
Okay, so no one else in the history of New York has ever been pursued under this set of circumstances except for Donald Trump.
This specific way, that's
So they breathed life into dead charges, brought them back to life, used them to go after Donald Trump, and it's never been done in the history of New York except against Donald Trump.
That's correct.
That's interesting. Go ahead, Ron. What do you want to say?
Let me address this issue just so that we have it clear. The statute of limitations had run on the charge of falsifying business records. To enlarge the statute of limitations, he had to allege that those records were created to conceal or commit another crime. The only other state crime that he alleged was, let's call it election interference. It was paying her to influence the election. A, that wasn't a crime, and B, it was time barred too. So he put two time barred claims together, one of which was wrong as a matter of law, the election interference one, and said, all right, now I've got a statute of limitations escape hatch, let's go. That was wrong.
But the New York law allows them to do it, right? I mean, that's how they were able to do it.
Yeah, but it was a big stretch to evade the statute of limitations. As I said earlier, they were cobbling together statutes in an unprecedented way to create a crime where none existed and to escape limitations.
And they've never done that before.
The one part of it, using the federal election law, they have filed falsified business records before. They've filed it with predicate crimes before. That's all been done. But so the falsifying of the business documents, as you said, the predicate crime, the second crime to make it a felony was this state election law of interference with an election, which only happens if it's done by unlawful means, right? I mean, because as we've talked about there's influencing an election. People do that all the time. That's what candidates do. You give speeches, you give rallies. That's all to influence the vote. But to make it an interference illegal, it has to be done by unlawful means. And what they then identified as three of the options for unlegal means, and yes, this is very confusing, this is why it's so hard for the jury to understand, was there was tax violations, there was this federal election violation, or there were more falsified business documents. That is what the jury had to go through to get to whether he was guilty or not.
All right, coming up, why some people say this case was politically motivated and not just purely legal. We'll be right back. Are you ready to jumpstart your health in 2025? Lumen can help. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It measures your metabolism through your breath and via the app tells you whether you're burning fat or carbs. It then provides tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, workouts, sleep, and stress management. Start your day by breathing into Lumen to check your metabolism. Based on your results, it gives you a personalized nutrition plan for the day. You can also use it before and after meals or workouts to understand how your body responds in real time. Your metabolism is your body's engine. Optimizing it can lead to better energy, easier weight management, improved fitness, and more. Take the next step towards better health. Visit lumen.me/Dr. Phil for 20% off your Lumen.
So we have an NDA, non-disclosure agreement. It's a big deal, a non-disclosure agreement. Totally honorable, totally good, totally accepted. Every company has non-disclosure agreements. But the press called it slush fund and all sorts of other things. Hush money, hush money. It's not hush money. It's called a non-disclosure agreement. So it's not hush money. It's a non-disclosure agreement, totally legal.
I'm going to be sitting down with former President Trump later this week and asking him a lot of questions about this. And as former President Trump was just saying, voters don't have a right to know what candidates' skeletons are. And if they can keep their skeletons hidden, they're not committing a crime. This is not about morality, it's about legality. Everybody puts their best foot forward. Every politician puts their best foot forward. They don't come out and say, I've got a brother that's an idiot. I've got a this or that. They don't lead with those things. We all know that. It's not a crime to have an NDA or pay hush money, which sounds smarmy, and maybe it is, but it's not illegal. You talked about skunks in the jury box. What do you mean skunks in the jury box?
Well, a skunk in the jury box is evidence that should not have been admitted. And in this case, there were several things that stunk because they were skunk-like. The first stinky thing was that Michael Cohen had pled guilty to a variety of criminal charges, one of which was violating the federal election laws by paying Stormy Daniels. That was utterly inadmissible for the purpose of using it as the prosecutors did, which was to say, well, if Cohen did it, so did Trump, because Cohen was paid back by Trump. So they put it in evidence saying, this is a legitimate thing for us to use as prosecutors because it undermines the credibility of Michael Cohen. But the prosecutors were vouching for Michael Cohen. They were not trying to undermine his credibility. They were trying to make the jury believe him. The judge let it in, and the prosecutors then abused it by saying what I just said. Well, if Michael Cohen violated the federal election laws, and it's an established fact, said they argued, that he did because he pled guilty to it, then so did Trump. That was a big skunk, and the judge tried to take the smell away in the jury instructions by saying Cohen's a guilty plea doesn't mean Trump's guilty. But the skunk stink was still there after that instruction. You can't unring that bell. That's one. Two, there were these other tales of hush money payments, one to a Playboy centerfold, one to a doorman, to keep quiet stories about Trump that were salacious and embarrassing. The judge shouldn't have let those in. He did, but they had no probative value. This is a question about falsified business records. What does Trump's engagements with a Playboy centerfold or whoever the doorman was talking, what does that have to do with falsified business records? Nothing. I think nearly any judge would have kept that out. This judge let it in, and it stunk.
And didn't this judge also say to Trump, if you take the witness stand, I'm going to let them cross-examine you about E. Jean Carroll and defamation claims and the contempt charges and a whole lot of other things that had nothing to do.
And the $450 million civil verdict that Letitia James got. The judge said, you better not. If you take the stand, Mr. Trump, I'm going to let them at you on stuff that hadn't got anything to do with this case. Trump didn't take the stand.
Although he didn't say you better not. You know, a judge can't do that. He gets in trouble for saying that.
Well, that was a clear message.
Yeah. All right, coming up, why wasn't this 12-0 verdict unanimous? Because you had to have a 12-0 verdict to get to a guilty standing, but was it 12-0 on everything inside the verdict? Now, it's been said there were actually death threats against this judge saying that he didn't require a 12-0 unanimous verdict. Did he or didn't he? It was 12-0 on guilty, but what about inside the charges? We'll talk about that next.
Is really at the fault of Judge Merchan. You have a situation where the actual federal crime about the election was never really identified anywhere through the trial, except at closing arguments by the prosecution. You didn't allow an FEC lawyer, one of the top people in the country with knowledge of how the Federal Election Commission actually works and looks at cases like this. They were not allowed to testify in open court in front of the jury. I think a lot of people are looking at this case and they see it for what it is. It is a sham. This was a railroad persecution of Donald Trump simply because Alvin Bragg and a lot of radical Democrats in our country wanted to get Donald Trump.
Well, tonight we're discussing the Donald Trump verdict, which I consider to be a judicial travesty. I think people have differing views on that, but I think this was something that was predicated on false business records. And actually, those records may have been false, but if they were, that statute of limitations had expired on those records, and they were regarding something that was not illegal, which was paying for a non-disclosure agreement with somebody that had a negative story about President Trump. So were they recorded properly or not? I don't know. Each one, the way they got to 34 claims was each time, each month, something was listed. There was a check and an invoice and a ledger entry. And so that was done each month, check, invoice, ledger entry. And that was 3 times each month. So each one of those was considered a felony. And so they multiplied that up. And
that's what we refer to as overcharging.
Yeah, that's what it could have been one charge,
Could have been
right?
one charge, yeah.
But they came up with 34 because it made for a great headline, 34 felony convictions. They also allowed Stormy Daniels to go into salacious detail about this alleged sexual encounter. That had nothing to do with business records.
Another skunk.
Another skunk, but they let it in. And that should not have been admitted. That should not have been allowed. It had nothing to do with the charges. It just made the jury look at him negatively. It was more prejudicial than probative. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think that's definitely a weighing that needs to be done in that case because a lot of information came out. She kept talking. The prosecution said, look, the defense got up and in the opening statements denied that the affair ever happened. That's why she was able to get on the stand and the judge allowed her to go on in so much detail. And then it allows the prosecution to say, look, while it was graphic and it was cringeworthy, those are the reasons why Mr. Trump didn't want it coming out before the election. That's why it was so important for him to be able to stop it. That's what the prosecution's argument was.
But the problem was that whether it happened or didn't happen had nothing to do with the crime alleged, with falsifying business records.
Well, the prosecution would argue it goes to the intent, right? There's always the intent element. There's the falsification of the business records with the intent to commit the second crime, which was the election interference. That's how the prosecution is allowed to bring in all this extra evidence, is it's going to show the intent element that they had to prove.
Well, let's talk about that second crime. So what was the second crime? Actually, they never specified what the second crime was, did they?
Until the trial.
Well, actually, at the trial, they said it could actually be violating New York election law, violating federal election law, or violating federal tax law. Take your pick. It could be any of these 3.
Well, I think it was a little bit more specific than that. So you had the falsifying of the business records, and then you had to have the second crime, right, that was going to make it. The second crime was specified as the New York State election law violation. Under that, you had to show it was done by unlawful means, and that's where you get to the 3 options. So there's actually a sort of a 3-part thing. And the first, you had to be found guilty unanimously, which is the falsifying of business records. The second crime, which is violating the state election law, had to be unanimous. But the 3 options of the unlawful means did not have to be unanimous. And that was confusing to many people.
Okay, I'll let you respond to that right after the break. Coming up are the takeaways, the lessons learned from this trial, something we need to pay attention to. We'll talk about that and let Rod respond to this unanimous and the 3 options when we come back. Tonight, we're discussing why Donald Trump's trial is such a unique case in United States history and what some say is a disgrace to the legal system. Some stand by it. Some say, hey, this was the system working. Some say, no, it wasn't. It was an abuse of the system. Rod, you say that this coming down to 3 different things for unlawful means is going to be a problem on appeal for the prosecution.
Yes. Let me begin by saying, I don't know if you followed what this description of what the prosecution did to give the jury these 3 choices. I read that charge. It's 55 pages long. If I had been in the jury room with that charge as a lawyer, I would not have been able to explain it to the jury. It was so circular and so convoluted that it only can be described as we just heard, which was confusing to me. But here's the problem with giving them three choices. The jury must convict by a unanimous verdict. But the judge said, you don't have to agree that election interference or tax violations or federal campaign law violations, you don't have to pick one of those and agree on it. If there's one of them that some of you agree on and some of you agree on another and some of you agree on a third, but you don't agree with each other, you can still convict if you got 12 votes that he did something wrong. That verdict was not unanimous, and it had to be.
So what you want to say? We've got about 1 minute.
Yeah, well, due respect, the jury instructions said you must conclude unanimously that the defendant conspired to promote or prevent the election of any person to the public office by unlawful means. You need not be unanimous as to what the unlawful means are. That's where and that is done in criminal trials all the time. They get options. Under felony murder rule, you can be held liable for a murder when they're not sure who fired the killing shot. So options are given to juries in different criminal cases. Here, they did have to find unanimously on the falsified documents. They did have to find unanimously on the second crime, which was the election interference. It was the options of deciding the unlawful means that they did not have to be unanimous on. They just had to pick one. They had to at least have one. But they didn't all have to have the same.
Mm-hmm. All right, final questions. Do you believe this case will be reversed?
I do, undoubtedly.
You don't think it's a close call?
I do not. Now, I don't know the New York Court of Appeals, but
that's the issue.
In Texas, out of here.
Yeah.
And if not at New York, it'll go to the federal. At some point, do you believe it will be reversed?
I think there are a lot of grounds of appeals. I think that the New York appellate courts are notorious for not granting a lot of appeals. I think it's 4% or something. But if there's a federal issue, it can get to the Supreme Court eventually.
Do you think it should be reversed?
You know, that's a very difficult question. I only look at this legally. I don't look at it from the outside. I think legally, it probably shouldn't have been filed in the first place, but appeals are based on the transcript of what actually happened in the courtroom. And so they can't look at the things that we've been talking about, whether it should have been filed or not. I think there are some novel things that happen in this case, that there are grounds for appeal, whether it should be or not. It's just a sad day. I think it's a sad day for our country that we have this conviction out there.
Well, I'm going to talk about that when we come back. I wanted to share my final thought about this. This weaponization of our great institutions, the FBI, Justice Department, and individual states' similar institutions, will lead to one of two outcomes. One is more of the same from the other side, tit for tat. That may seem deserved, but it is not the right way forward for America. The other is what I call on you to demand from your politicians today, an end to this craziness in order to save the soul and sanity of our country. The Pope has actually given us the right approach in his new book when he says, we are all brothers and sisters, and there must be no resentment among us. For any war to truly end, forgiveness is necessary. That is true of any war, including our current cultural war. We need our Justice Department to return to the business of meting out justice and not running the political agendas of those currently in power, blindly seeking convictions, warranted or otherwise, and attacking political opponents. That requires a very few important things from each of you, from all of us. Finding your voice, forgiveness, and focus on the way forward. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. Forgiveness, and at the same time requiring better. We are not some banana republic, for God's sakes. What are we going to do next? Have a Putin poisoning posse? And start finding political opponents foaming at the mouth at home, not so mysteriously dying in their lazy boy recliners? We're better than that. We must be better than that. I don't like what I see happening in our country. This kind of thing is exactly why I launched Merit TV and wrote, We've Got Issues. I don't like seeing the weaponization of our justice system, agencies, and powerful government actions that, frankly, just make my skin crawl. for all of us and for my grandchildren. And let's be honest, this is so not just about Trump. If you let your hatred for Donald Trump compromise your ability to find true north on your moral compass, shame on you. If you let your disgust for Biden make you blind to the inevitable consequences of pursuing revenge, then God help the children who will inherit the dystopian nightmare we create. We need leaders who will pledge to end this vicious cycle right now and return us to that safe place where our institutions are no longer bastardized and weaponized, but rather simply serve their intended purpose. We have serious problems to solve, and it will take serious people to solve them. Men and women who we hold accountable for doing that which they were selected or hired to do. They need to know we are watching, and their positions are privileges, not legacies. They work for us until they don't. I'm not into politics. I claim no expertise, nor do I seek any. I stay in my lane addressing human behavior collectively, culturally, and am focused on how we can have maximum control in our lives and turn this ship of state called America in the right direction and get her back on track so we can be proud. That's my mission, and this is a call to action to save our collective soul and sanity. This is also a call to redemption, healing, and forgiveness that leads to peace among us all, which is the most important gift we can share in our dangerous world. The current administration could and should do the right thing. Dismiss now, even now, post-conviction of a political opponent, all such lawfare, and pledge to return to the normal functioning of a government rightly run. God bless you all, and God bless these United States of America.